Christmas Eve in Stalingrad, 24th December, 1942. The night when Christmas was only a test of whether a man was still pretending to be human. Christmas Eve in Stalingrad is not a story about a tree made of shell casings or carols sung among ruins. It is a story about a threshold moment, the point at which war stops being an event and becomes an environment, like an ocean. And a human being inside it either lives or drowns. December 24th, 1942 has one defining feature that immediately separates it from other Christmases at the front. It is a Christmas after the illusion has shattered. The day before, on December 23rd, the German attempt to break the encirclement comes to an end. Operation Winter Storm failed. The ring does not break. Hope does not return. And suddenly, Christmas Eve becomes something else entirely. Not a pause in fighting, not a day of remembrance, but a psychological autopsy, a test of what remains of an army once it stops believing in rescue. This is the moment when the word cauldron ceases to be a military term. It becomes a description of a human being.
Weihnachten im Kessel.
Christmas Eve in the cauldron as an operation on meaning. Nazi propaganda loved the word Festung, fortress, Fortress Stalingrad. In reality, it was not a fortress, but a sealed sack of flesh, trying not to rot before being opened. And on Christmas Eve, all of this rises to the surface because holidays always do one thing. They remind you that a normal world exists. That is why holidays at war are always either an anesthetic, so you don't go mad, or a form of torture, because they expose the abyss between then and now. In Stalingrad in 1942, it was torture. Context: a cauldron that no longer believes. Inside the cauldron are hundreds of thousands of people. Estimates vary by moment and condition. But more important than the number is this: the system no longer provides the basics of biology. The airlift does not meet requirements. Weather, distance, Soviet anti-aircraft fire, and chaos at airfields do their work. In practice, what arrives is too little and too late. And then comes Christmas Eve. When food and fuel are lacking, holidays are not an atmosphere. Holidays are logistics. Do you have anything festive? A candle? Warmth for 1 hour? Even the illusion of ritual? In the cauldron, ritual becomes currency. Psychology: what a holiday does to hunger. In normal life, holidays are about excess, more food, more light, more time. In Stalingrad, holidays are the irony of an excess that does not exist. Hunger has 3 stages. A person thinks about food, a person talks about food, a person becomes food, for war, for disease, for cold. On Christmas Eve, this process gets an accelerant because the mind opens its archive, how it was, how it should be. And if that archive still works, it hurts. That is why what happened in the cauldron in December 1942 matters so much. The birth of a symbol. Kurt Reuber and the Madonna of Stalingrad. Inside the cauldron, there was a doctor and pastor, Kurt Reuber, and in December 1942, he drew the famous Madonna of Stalingrad. On the drawing appear the words Weihnachten in Kessel, 1942, and Festung Stalingrad, along with the triad Licht, Leben, Liebe, Light, 1942, Life, Love. This is not a curious detail. It is proof that inside the cauldron a second battle was being fought, over whether a human being still possesses a language of meaning. Reuber described the conditions under which the drawing was made: cramped space, mud, lack of materials, maps used as paper, constant jostling, pencils disappearing. In his account, there is something worse than hardship. There is the reflex that something impractical must be done, because pure practicality will kill them. This is precisely the mechanism of Christmas Eve in the Cauldron, to create a sign that says, "We are not yet only animals in the snow." Reuber does not paint victory. He does not paint a soldier. By painting a mother and child, he does something almost insolent. He invokes safety in a place that is the definition of its absence. Then he carries the drawing into bunkers and shows it to the men. The reaction is almost always the same: silence and suspension. Reuber describes soldiers entering shelters and stopping before the image, as if for 1 second they had returned home. This is the analytical key. Christmas Eve in Stalingrad was not a holiday, but a simulation of home in conditions where home no longer exists. Fortress Stalingrad, private religion versus state religion. The Nazi narrative tried to baptize the cauldron religiously: fortress, honor, endurance, an example for the Reich. It was a state religion, meaning by command. Reuber does the opposite. He does not say, "endure for the Führer," but invokes a meaning that is not political. And that is why the Madonna worked, because it was apolitical at the very center of a political slaughter. At this point it must be said plainly, Christmas Eve in the Cauldron is the moment when many minds stop believing in big words and begin searching for small anchors: an image, a prayer, a gesture, one cigarette, one candle. This is no longer patriotism. It is personal psychological hygiene. Christmas Eve as the organization of last order. Holidays in the Cauldron were neither mass nor uniform. They were micro-ceremonies, in a shelter, a cellar, a dugout. Their purpose was simple: for 30 minutes to restore structure to time. Because total war does the worst possible thing: it destroys the calendar. Day stops being day, night stops being night. There is only survive until the next moment. Christmas Eve is an attempt to say, this is December 24th, and therefore a date still exists, not only frost.
The Soviet side. A Christmas Eve without Christmas. A victory that is also hell. Here one must be careful with cheap symmetry, because while on the German side Christmas Eve is a culturally real holiday, on the Red Army's side Christmas Eve as a Christian ritual does not exist in a state that marginalized, controlled, and instrumentalized religion. But that does not mean December 24th had no meaning. It did, just a different one. It was the moment when the enemy ceased to have a future. On the Soviet side, in December 1942, there is a brutal clarity. The cauldron is sealed, and the relief attempt has failed. This is no longer a fight of, can we stop them? It is a fight of, how do we finish them? And what will it cost us? And here enters the second, darker truth. Victory at Stalingrad was also a form of damnation, because the city and its surroundings were a space where people died en masse on both sides, and the Red Army paid for every meter of ruin with blood. Moral asymmetry. Home versus the cause. On the German side, Christmas Eve is longing for home. On the Soviet side, the dominant narrative is the cause: defense of the motherland, revenge, necessity, Stalin, the state. This is not just propaganda, it is also emotion. Stalingrad was a symbol, and symbols in war are fuel. But fuel has a price, and that price is the dehumanization of the enemy. When the enemy is a fascist, an invader, a pest, it becomes easier to finish him off. And Stalingrad required finishing off,
because the very nature of the cauldron meant annihilation. Christmas Eve as operational silence. The Soviets had no need to celebrate December 24th. In practice, the front moved to its own rhythm: artillery, reconnaissance, assaults, counter-assaults, the clearing of ruins. But Christmas Eve still had operational significance. It was a night when the enemy could be psychologically softer, not because of carols, but because of collapse. If the cauldron is an organism, then December 24th is the moment when the organism understands there will be no rescue. This is psychological hypothermia. The Soviets may not have named it, but they could observe it. More surrenders, more disintegrating discipline, more soldiers who were no longer fighting for victory, only for an end. Holiday as propaganda of victory. In a total state, every great battle becomes a holiday of power. Stalingrad was to become proof the system works. But here lies the paradox. The system worked because it was merciless toward enemies and toward its own people. And this is the analytical core. For the Red Army, there was no Christmas Eve, but there was a religion of victory, secular, state-driven. And that religion demanded sacrifice. Not a lamb. Human beings.
3 layers of meaning colliding. Layer 1. Biology, hunger, and frost. Christmas Eve is romantic only in photographs. In the cauldron, it was survival logistics, where the holidays meant, do you have warmth, even for a moment? Do you have something to swallow? Do you still have a voice to form a sentence? Do you still have a conscience that functions? Hunger reduces a human being to a single axis, to obtain. Holidays try to add a second axis, to remember. And that collision is crushing. Layer 2. Psychology. Home as a weapon against despair. Reuber and the Madonna are not a beautiful story. They are a tool that does one thing. It allows people to cry. And crying in total war is a luxury, because crying means you still feel. Accounts of soldiers' reactions to the drawing, stopping, silence, emotion, show that Christmas Eve became a moment when emotions normally clenched shut like jaws were briefly released. Not joy, release. Layer 3. Metaphysics. Does God have the right to enter the cauldron? The strongest question of that Christmas Eve is this: does faith make sense in a place that is the product of a human decision for mass death? Reuber answers in his own way, not with an argument, but with an image. Light, life, love. This is not a theological answer. It is an existential one. If the body cannot be saved, try to save inner order. And on the Soviet side, even where religion was officially marginalized, there existed a different metaphysics, the metaphysics of victory and necessity. And it was just as merciless. The other side of the same night. The Red Army and the Christmas Eve that does not exist. On the other side of the ruins of Stalingrad, there is no Christmas Eve. But there is night. There is frost. There is exhaustion. And there is the awareness that the enemy is dying in confinement. This, too, is a threshold experience. 1. No holiday does not equal no emotions. The fact that the Red Army did not celebrate Christmas Eve does not mean that December 24th was an ordinary day. It was the day after the failed relief attempt. It was the day when it became clear they are not getting out of there. That changes the psychology of the fighter, because if the enemy has no future, then fighting ceases to be a clash it becomes a process of liquidation. And that is terrifying even for the victor. 2. Dehumanization as a tool. At this moment, Soviet propaganda was ruthless but effective. The enemy was a fascist, not a man in ruins. This simplified decisions. It facilitated assaults. It reduced hesitation. But it came at a price: the erosion of empathy. And Christmas Eve, even absent as a ritual, worked as a contrast. It was known that they were marking something. It was known that they were weaker. And this produced a mixture of contempt, triumph, and exhaustion. Because fighting in the ruins of Stalingrad was a nightmare for the victors as well. 3. Victory as a burden. Analyses often omit one fact. The Red Army was bled dry. Victory was not a march in floodlights. It was wading through rubble, fighting for basements, clearing buildings, losses counted in the hundreds of thousands. December 24th was not a day of joy. It was a day of necessity, of finishing the slaughter, because the slaughter was already underway. And here a mirror image of the German Christmas Eve appears. There, an attempt to preserve humanity in defeat. Here, an attempt to maintain determination in victory. Both sides were psychologically at the limit. 4. War as an environment, not an event. The strongest conclusion of that night is simple and cruel. Stalingrad in December 1942 was no longer a battle. It was an ecosystem of death, in which people functioned like organisms adapted to a toxic environment. In such a world, Christmas Eve cannot be a holiday. It can only be an anomaly. And that is precisely why this night is narratively so important, because it shows that even the greatest symbols of culture, religion, and home fracture under the weight of total war. After Christmas Eve, when hope dies officially. If Christmas Eve in Stalingrad was a moment of suspension, then December 25th was the return of gravity. And that gravity pulled only downward. After December 24th, something qualitatively new happens inside the cauldron. Hope stops being a topic of conversation, not because everyone loses it at the same moment, but because it becomes unbelievable. And unbelievable hope is not comfort. It is a burden. 1. Time after the holidays. The psychology of after everything. In normal life, after the holidays comes a dip in mood. In Stalingrad, what comes is the collapse of the psychological structure that Christmas Eve had briefly propped up. Many soldiers later wrote that after December 24th, something inside them closed. There was no more tension, no rebellion. There was functional resignation. This is the key concept. Not dramatic breakdowns, but a quiet decision by the organism. I will no longer invest energy in the future. A person who stops investing energy in the future begins to sleep longer, react more slowly, avoid risk, stop fighting for rations, stop protesting. From the standpoint of biology, this is the beginning of dying. 2. Disease as a second front. After Christmas Eve, the medical front inside the cauldron explodes, not as a sudden blast, but as an uncontrolled flood. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, frostbite turning into gangrene. Doctors no longer treat, doctors triage. This is a terrible moment because it marks a shift from the logic of whom can we help to the logic of who is still worth treating. Here, Christmas Eve functions as a moral contrast. Just a day earlier, there was still an attempt to be human. Now the system says, we cannot afford humanity. 3. Hunger after the holidays, when even the symbol disappears. Christmas Eve was the last moment when rations were still divided symbolically. After it, there are no more holiday remnants. What remains? Thin soup, scraps of horse meat, frozen fragments of bread. But something else matters more. The rhythm disappears. Eating stops being an event. It becomes a reaction to stomach pain. Accounts from the cauldron increasingly mention eating alone, hiding pieces of food, silence during meals. This is the signal of community breakdown. Christmas Eve was the last attempt to be together. After it, everyone begins to die alone. 4. The subject no one likes. Cannibalism. This must be said plainly, without sensation. In Stalingrad, acts of cannibalism did occur. Not mass, not systematic, but real. And this is one of the reasons Christmas Eve matters so much narratively. It marks the last moment before crossing boundaries that a human being does not want to cross. Cannibalism in the cauldron was not savagery. It was an act of biological desperation. It is not done by evil people. It is done by people whose organisms have taken command. Christmas Eve was a moment when culture, ritual, and shame still existed. After it, biology began to win. 5. Breakdown of discipline. The army as a collection of bodies. After December 24th, the pattern becomes clear. More unauthorized absences, more passive behavior, fewer reactions to orders. This is not rebellion, it is erosion. An army functions only when meaning exists, a future exists, energy exists. After Christmas Eve in the cauldron, none of these remain. What is left is a formal structure that still stands, but is internally empty. 6. Command and silence. The most dramatic aspect after December 24th appears at the top. The command of the Sixth Army, with Friedrich Paulus at its head, is trapped in an absolute contradiction. Militarily, the cauldron is unsalvageable. Politically, surrender is forbidden. This produces decision-making silence, and in such a situation, the absence of decisions works like a slow poison. No one knows what to prepare for. No one knows how long it will last. No one knows whether to fight or conserve strength. Christmas Eve was the moment when soldiers were still waiting. After it, they began merely enduring. And endurance without purpose is one of the most destructive forms of existence.